What kind of man straps himself to a canvas tether, hangs out the open door of a flying machine, and fires a machine gun into a jungle that is firing back? What kind of institution looks at that position? No armor, no cover, no protection between a 19-year-old and the earth 1,000 feet below, except a strip of nylon webbing and his own grip on a weapon, and declares it an acceptable assignment for a human being. And what happens to that 19-year-old for the 50 years after he somehow survives it? The popular legend says a door gunner on a Vietnam-era Huey helicopter had a life expectancy of 5 minutes in combat. That number has been repeated in books, in documentaries, in the first-hand testimony of veterans who lived through the war, in Hollywood films that burned it into the cultural memory of an entire nation. It has become one of the most cited and most recognized statistics of the entire Vietnam conflict. It is wrong. The truth is not more comforting. In several critical ways, the truth is considerably worse than the legend ever managed to be. Forget everything the movies taught you about this job. Today we are assembling a file that the Pentagon never combined in one place, because the numbers, when they are properly arranged next to each other, tell a story that the doctrine's architects preferred not to have to confront. Stay until the end of this. What you are about to learn will permanently change how you understand the word courage. Tell me in the comments, have you ever stood close enough to a Huey helicopter to feel the rotor wash on your face? Because the men who flew in those open doorways say that sound alone, encountered decades later at an air show or a quiet veteran ceremony, can stop them cold where they stand. The machine that created the door gunner began, improbably enough, as a rescue vehicle. In 1955, the United States Army issued a design competition for a new medical evacuation helicopter. The Korean War had demonstrated that rotary wing aircraft could save lives in ways that ground transport never could. Fragile, piston-powered machines had pulled wounded men from forward positions and delivered them to surgical units in time to survive injuries that would have been fatal a full day earlier. What the Army wanted now was something faster, more reliable, and turbine-powered. Something that could carry more men, fly farther distances, and survive the rigors of sustained combat operations without shaking itself to pieces in the field. Bell Helicopter won the contract. Their XH-40 prototype flew for the first time on the 20th of October, 1956. And the Army liked what it saw enough to move quickly toward production. When the production model finally entered service, it was designated the HU-1A, which stood for Helicopter Utility Model 1A. Those 3 letters, HU-1, produced the nickname that no subsequent bureaucratic renaming effort would ever dislodge from the vocabulary of the men who flew it. In 1962, the Army reorganized its entire designation system and officially changed the title to UH-1, placing utility before helicopter in the formal acronym. The soldiers who flew the machine ignored the change completely. They kept calling it what they had always called it from the first day they climbed inside it. Institutions can rename equipment whenever they choose. What they cannot rename is the relationship that forms between men and the machines that carry them into danger. What no one in 1956 had fully calculated was that this aircraft, conceived and designed specifically to carry the wounded away from battle, would instead become the primary vehicle for carrying the battle directly to the enemy. Vietnam transformed the Huey's purpose completely the moment the first ones arrived in country. The doctrine of air mobility was built on the idea that infantry forces could be rapidly inserted and extracted by helicopter, striking anywhere within operational range, bypassing roads and rivers and terrain features that would stop conventional forces dead, materializing where the enemy least expected to find them. This doctrine was constructed entirely around the Huey's specific capabilities. 7,013 of them would ultimately serve in the Vietnam War. Together across the length of the conflict, they would fly 7,531,955 combined flight hours. The United States Army's entire strategy for fighting this particular war in this particular country was predicated on the assumption that these machines would keep flying and keep delivering men into battle regardless of what the enemy tried to do about it. The doctrine was elegant on paper. It promised speed, surprise, and a degree of operational flexibility that conventional infantry operations fighting on foot could simply never achieve. What it did not fully account for was what happened during the 30 seconds when a helicopter had committed to its descent into a landing zone. Too slow to evade, too exposed to hide, holding its course steady and level, while the infantry scrambled out the doors. In those 30 seconds, the aircraft's only meaningful defense against everything on the ground, trying to destroy it, was the man in the open door with a machine gun. The doctrine had created a position of extraordinary and deliberate exposure. Now it needed men willing to occupy it. The Army conceptualized that position as fourth on a list of 4 crew members. The aircraft commander came first. The co-pilot, called the Peter pilot in the common parlance of the squadrons, a name that communicated with precision exactly what experienced crews thought of inexperienced ones, came second. The crew chief, who maintained the aircraft and manned the left side door gun, came third. The door gunner, who manned the right side gun and assisted with everything else on the aircraft, came last. He was not an afterthought exactly, but he was the last thought. The war would spend the next decade providing a thorough and expensive education in exactly what that position demanded from the men who filled it, and exactly what it cost them. To understand the men who filled it, you have to first overturn the assumption that most people bring to this subject. The comfortable, cinema-approved version of the story holds that door gunners were volunteers to a man. Warriors who sought the danger, who were drawn by something deep in their character to the most exposed position in the entire helicopter war. The reality is considerably more instructive about how institutions manage human lives during wartime than any single act of documented heroism. Neville Wiggins arrived in Vietnam in 1970 as an air defense guard with the Royal Australian Air Force. His designated assignment upon arrival was perimeter security at the Australian base at Nui Dat. Within 1 month of arriving in country, he had been selected as a door gunner on a bushranger helicopter gunship. The 2 criteria used for this transition, from guarding a fence perimeter to hanging out of an armed gunship over active firefights in enemy territory, were as follows. The candidate needed a driver's license, and he needed to speak clearly enough on a radio to be understood by the people he was communicating with. No formal assessment of psychological nerve under fire. No evaluation of physical aptitude under sustained combat pressure. A driver's license and intelligible radio speech. That was the full institutional measure of what qualified a young man for the most exposed crewing position in the entire helicopter war. Doug Kaler, from Fairmont, Minnesota, was not even offered that much deliberation. He arrived at his aviation company in Vietnam in June of 1969, having already volunteered for the war itself, having completed his training as a firefighter, and having discovered upon arrival that the company had no vacancy for a firefighter among its personnel needs. The offer extended to him was completely straightforward: mechanic or door gunner. He chose the doorway without extensive reflection on what that choice would actually entail in practice, not because he fully understood what he was selecting, because the alternative seemed less interesting to a 20-year-old who had come a long way to be part of something. He was 20 years old. John Masaki was drafted into the Army against his preferences. He had significant reservations about the war itself, about the conscription process that had interrupted his civilian life without asking his opinion, about the genuine possibility of dying violently in a country he had never intended to visit under any circumstances. He trained. He processed through the system. He was assigned to his unit. And then, when early indications suggested that his particular unit might not deploy to Vietnam after all, he found himself experiencing something he later acknowledged with some honesty was probably not entirely rational. He felt disappointed by the possibility of not going. The military's training program had performed its essential psychological function so thoroughly and efficiently that it had fundamentally rearranged his instincts about risk. It had successfully made him want the very thing he should, by any reasonable measure, have continued to fear. These were not unusual profiles among the men who ended up in those doorways. The typical door gunner was somewhere between 18 and 22 years old. Many had not yet completed the neurological development that governs accurate long-term risk assessment in human beings. They were placed in the open doorway of a machine, about to fly toward people who were actively and professionally trying to destroy it. Told to fire first and fire as continuously as possible, and most of them did exactly that with a commitment that still defies easy explanation. Some made decisions in fractions of seconds during those missions that they would carry in their bodies for the rest of their lives. Some of those decisions were acts of extraordinary courage that deserved far more recognition than they ever received. Some of them were things the survivors could not speak of for decades after the war ended, if they could speak of them at all without the words breaking down. Jim Chancellor flew with the 119th Assault Helicopter Company across his tour of duty in Vietnam. He survived the war and came home. He was married 4 times in the years that followed. He entered drug and alcohol treatment programs twice. Standing before an audience at Indiana University Northwest years after the war had officially been declared over, he offered the reframing that had taken him decades of painful living to arrive at. PTSD is not what is wrong with you, he told them. It is what happened to you. That us distinction between a character defect that a man should be ashamed of and a wound that was inflicted upon him by circumstances he did not fully choose, was not available to him or to any of the men who came home from those doorways when they actually needed it most. They returned to a country that had decided the war was a catastrophic mistake, and many of them were made to feel, sometimes explicitly and sometimes through sustained institutional indifference, that they themselves were part of that mistake. The damage that accumulated across hundreds of missions in those open doorways did not announce itself with the immediate clarity of a bullet wound. It arrived over time, and it compounded with each passing year. And by the time its true nature was finally understood and named, much of it had already calcified into something permanent in the men who carried it. The physical reality of what a door gunner actually occupied requires specific and careful description, because the official accounts and the historical literature have never adequately conveyed it to people who were not there. Statistics alone are insufficient for the purpose. Military doctrine is entirely silent on the subject of what it feels like. To genuinely understand what the job was, you must stand in the doorway with the man and look at what surrounds him. The M60D machine gun was mounted on a ridged metal pedestal equipped with mechanical stops that limited the arc of fire to 180 degrees front to back and approximately 60 degrees of elevation above and below the horizontal. It fired 7.62 millimeter ammunition at a cyclic rate of 600 to 700 rounds per minute under standard operating conditions. Standard issue ammunition cans held 500 rounds each. Field modifications to the mounting and feeding systems, unauthorized by every regulation in existence and practiced by essentially every crew that flew regularly, extended the effective ammunition capacity to approximately 2,000 rounds before reloading became necessary. For every 4 standard ball rounds loaded into the belt, there was 1 tracer round. Not for spectacle or visual effect, but because the tracer's visible flight path allowed a gunner to walk his fire systematically onto a target that he often could not otherwise clearly see through the vegetation and smoke of an active firefight. In the air, at cruising speed, the slipstream helped cool the barrel during sustained firing. This was one of the genuinely few advantages that the doorway position offered to the men in it. And even this advantage was not sufficient when the shooting became serious. In sustained heavy combat, door gunners routinely fired in continuous bursts of 100 rounds, 200 rounds, 300 rounds, without any pause for cooling. The barrel behind the gas piston would begin to glow visibly red in the darker conditions of early morning or late afternoon. Missions. 3 spare barrels was the minimum loadout that any experienced gunner would accept before a mission. Many crews carried 6. There were specific missions, remembered and recounted decades later by the men who flew them with the particular precision that only extreme experience produces. When a gunner could not stop the firing long enough to execute a barrel change before the situation on the ground deteriorated further. The barrel continued to glow. The gun continued to fire. Eventually, it reached a point where it physically could not fire anymore. The man holding it did not have that option. Some men modified their personal weapons in ways that would have alarmed every ordnance officer in the Army, and were practiced in various forms by nearly everyone who flew gunship missions with any regularity. A partial operating rod installed in place of the standard one, a few ordinary washers placed with deliberate care under the buffer spring inside the buttstock, pushed the cyclic rate above 1,000 rounds per minute under field conditions. This modification was illegal under every applicable regulation, completely undocumented in any official record, and essentially universal among the crews who needed every possible advantage when the shooting started. One veteran of gunship operations recalled carrying 2,500 rounds in a large ammunition can wedged between his legs on every single mission he flew, and noted, with a specific kind of matter-of-factness that communicates more about a situation than any amount of dramatic description could, that the supply did not tend to last particularly long once a serious engagement began. The body armor issued to all helicopter aircrew was a ceramic and steel protective vest that the men had taken to calling the chicken plate. On paper, according to every regulation and every safety briefing, it was worn on the torso where it could protect the vital organs from small arms fire. In volunteer practice, a very substantial number of door gunners removed it from their backs and placed it on the seat beneath them instead, sitting on it for the duration of every mission. This choice has sometimes been characterized by people who were not there as a form of bravado, a gesture of contempt for personal safety. It was not bravado. It was a calculation made by men who understood their specific geometry of danger with considerable accuracy. The most statistically probable lethal threat to a man sitting in the open side doorway of a Huey was not a round arriving from the side, where the armor worn on the torso would intercept it. It was a round coming from directly below, fired upward through the dangerously thin aluminum floor of the aircraft, by an enemy on the ground, who had calculated the same geometry from a different angle. The plate positioned under the seat might or might not stop such a round, depending on its caliber and velocity. The plate worn on the back definitively stopped nothing approaching from that particular direction. The men who made this trade were not dismissing their personal safety. They were making the most rational available choice given the specific physics of their specific situation. What connected the gunner physically to the machine he was riding was a short canvas tether called the monkey strap, the single material link between a human body and the aircraft that was all that stood between him and the earth below. During the steep bank angles that gun runs required, centrifugal force did the majority of the work of keeping a man in the doorway. The canvas tether managed whatever centrifugal force did not cover. Veterans of gunship operations describe banking at angles severe enough that they were looking directly straight down at the jungle canopy below them, the ground revolving in their field of vision as the aircraft turned. They describe maintaining accurate fire on targets in this orientation. They describe doing this on mission after mission, week after week, across the full 12 months of a combat tour. The gun fired until it reached the point where it could not. The man holding it kept firing until his mission was complete. The moment all of this equipment and training and carefully managed fear collided with its actual operational purpose was called a hot landing zone. The hot LZ was not a dramatic exception in the helicopter war, not a rare emergency to be recounted in letters home. It was a predictable operational condition, the situation that arose with regular and deadly frequency whenever a prepared enemy force was waiting at the intended point of insertion with weapons ready. A standard combat assault assembled a formation of 8 to 10 troop-carrying slicks, flanked by 2 or 3 armed gunships on either side. The entire package watched over from an altitude of 3,000 feet by a command and control aircraft, whose elevation kept it safely above the range at which accurately aimed. Small arms fire became truly dangerous. The door gunners riding in those slicks understood something about that arrangement that never made it into the official doctrine. The man making the critical decisions about their survival and the timing of their approaches was orbiting at an altitude where he genuinely could not hear the gunfire that those decisions were producing on the ground. As the formation descended toward the landing zone, the gunships swept ahead of the troop carriers, firing rockets and machine guns into the tree lines and paddy dikes and hedgerows that might conceal enemy positions. This preparation was called prepping the landing zone, and it was designed to suppress whatever enemy force might be waiting to engage the vulnerable slicks during their approach. The Viet Cong, over the course of years of repeated contact with American helicopter operations, had developed a specific and effective tactical answer to it. They had studied American helicopter approach, patterns with a methodical attention and patience that the Americans had never quite managed to apply with equal consistency in the other direction. They understood the typical approach profiles, the standard altitudes, the characteristic speeds at various phases of the descent. They had identified with operational precision that cost American lives to teach them the exact moment when a descending Huey crossed the threshold of commitment, the point where the aircraft was too low to climb out quickly, too slow to evade aimed fire from the ground, and committed to holding its course level and steady for the infantrymen to exit the doors. They had learned through repeated experience to absorb the gunship preparatory fire from their prepared bunkers and trenches without responding to it, and simply to wait in silence for the right moment. The timing of their fire, when it finally came, was not a matter of instinct or aggression. It was established doctrine, deliberately planned and rehearsed. When the slicks flared for landing and the door gunner's effective field of fire was most geometrically constrained and the pilots were most fully occupied with the demands of keeping the aircraft stable for dismount, the enemy emerged from their positions and engaged with everything they had. In those seconds, 10 of them, 15, occasionally as many as 20, the door gunner was the only meaningful defensive system the aircraft possessed in practical terms. He had to identify enemy firing positions through the smoke and dense vegetation and complete disorientation of an active firefight. Aim a machine gun at targets he could frequently not clearly distinguish from the surrounding environment, suppress those positions with sufficient fire to prevent them from achieving accurate aim, and accomplish all of this simultaneously while rounds were already coming through the thin aluminum skin of the fuselage around him, while the pilots shouted urgent information on the intercom, while the infantry troops scrambled and pushed past him to get out of the aircraft as quickly as possible. The fuselage itself provided no meaningful ballistic protection to anyone inside it. A standard AK-47 round, the most common weapon aimed at American helicopters throughout the war, passed through the Huey's aluminum skin with approximately the same resistance it would have encountered passing through a particularly stubborn sheet of cardboard. Doug Kaler experienced the arithmetic of this situation directly and personally on a mission in the Central Highlands of Vietnam. His helicopter took fire during an approach. The round that found him carried shrapnel into his leg, with enough force to require immediate medical attention. He was evacuated first to a hospital facility in Pleiku, then transferred to a military hospital in Japan for the surgery his wound required, and spent 3 full weeks in that facility before being honorably discharged in June of 1970. He carried home a Purple Heart Medal as his formal documentation of what had happened to him. The mission that put that shrapnel in his leg was not exceptional by any standard applicable to his service in the Central Highlands. It was a Tuesday. The veteran who flew with Bravo Company of the 158th Aviation Battalion, the unit called the Lancers that was attached to the 101st Airborne Division, described the sustained reality of this work without theatrical emphasis, which is in itself a highly specific form of testimony about what the accumulation of missions does to a man's relationship with dramatic language. 2 Hueys on a given mission, 8 crew members distributed between them, the door gunner carrying responsibility for suppressive fire on both sides of the aircraft as the tactical situation required it. Lightly armed by any conventional military measure that would have meant anything in a different kind of war, moving at speed through terrain that had comprehensively devoured American strategy and continued to do so regardless of what resources were committed. They went where they were directed to go. They came back or they did not come back. One veteran of operations in the A Shao Valley, one of the most savagely and persistently contested operational corridors in the entire conflict, and a place where American commanders tried to avoid sending units whenever any alternative existed, reduced the lived mathematics of the hot landing zone to a single sentence that required no elaboration. "We went in with 15 helicopters," he said, "and came out with 6 or 7. One of the gunships got blown up in the sky." He said it without particular vocal emphasis. By the point in his service when he was describing these missions, he had witnessed this outcome enough times that the emphasis had simply worn away from the words. The Australian experience of this same operational reality carried its own distinctive texture, shaped by the particular demands of Kien Tuong Province and the units that No. 9 Squadron of the Royal Australian Air Force found itself supporting throughout the years of Australian military commitment to the war. The squadron deployed to Nui Dat in the middle months of 1966, bringing 16 Iroquois helicopters and crews who had trained extensively in Australia, without any of the specific contextual knowledge that combat operations in Vietnam would provide to them at considerable cost in the months that followed. When they arrived, there was no armor plating installed on their aircraft. There were no issued flak jackets for the crews who would be flying in the doorways. When the men who manned those door positions needed physical protection from the fire that was directed at them, they were required to obtain it by scrounging and trading with the American units that had been allocated proper equipment, because the Australians had not been given it through official channels. In August of 1966, approximately 6 weeks after the squadron arrived in country and began flying operational missions, 2 of their aircraft were called upon to support an infantry engagement that had rapidly transformed from a standard patrol contact into a situation of genuine catastrophe for the forces involved. 108 soldiers of D Company, 6th Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment, had been engaged near a rubber plantation in the vicinity of Long Tan by an enemy force estimated by the commanders who were trying to understand what was happening at approximately 2,000 fighters. The Australians were holding their position against this pressure, but only because Australian artillery was maintaining a volume of fire sufficient to prevent the enemy from completely overrunning their perimeter. And the ammunition required to sustain that rate of fire was running out at a rate that made simple calculation tell anyone who did the arithmetic that the company would not survive through the night without resupply reaching them. 2 No. 9 Squadron Hueys flew to them. They flew without any gunship escort whatsoever. They flew with no armor on the airframes, and with flak jackets that belonged to American units worn by the Australian crews inside them. They flew through torrential monsoon rain at treetop height, navigating through conditions that made precise instrument, flying genuinely dangerous, entirely independent of what the enemy forces surrounding the company's position might choose to do about their presence. They found the company's position in the failing light of late afternoon and delivered the ammunition that was needed. 108 soldiers held their perimeter until reinforcements arrived, carried forward in armored personnel carriers that had themselves been required to fight through dispersed enemy elements to reach the position in time. The Army had spent the first 6 weeks of the squadron's deployment developing serious reservations about the capabilities and commitment of No. 9 Squadron RAAF. After the Long Tan resupply flight, it did not register that reservation in any form again. By 1969, 4 of the squadron's aircraft had been converted into dedicated gunship configurations, given the operational name Bush Rangers. Each of these converted aircraft carried twin fixed forward-firing miniguns mounted on both sides of the fuselage, 2 7-tube rocket pods capable of delivering substantial firepower against ground targets, and 2 door-mounted M60 machine guns operated by the crew members in the open doorways. 6 separate weapon systems on a single airframe flying combat missions over Kien Tuong Province. The door gunners on a Bush Ranger were not a defensive measure of last resort. They were fully integrated offensive components of a weapons platform designed and operated with the specific intention of flying directly at whatever the problem on the ground happened to be. The missions the Bush Rangers flew in support of the Australian SAS were categorically unlike any standard combat assault insertion that American or Australian helicopter crews flew as routine operations. Australian SAS patrols in Kien Tuong typically consisted of 5 men operating deep in enemy-controlled territory, sometimes in direct and active contact with enemy forces that vastly outnumbered them when the call for emergency extraction came through. There was no cleared and secured perimeter to land within. There was no safe approach corridor that could be identified and used. There was a small patrol that needed to leave the position it was in, and a helicopter crew that had received the call and made the decision to come and get them regardless of what the ground situation looked like when they arrived. Wiggins described what this actually demanded of the crews with the directness of a man who had genuinely been there and had genuinely looked down at what was happening below him. Sometimes, he said, the SAS soldiers on the ground asked for rockets fired straight up, meaning ordnance delivered against a target so close to their own position that the request itself, stripped of any military language, was communicating precisely how close the enemy was and how desperate the situation had become. The Bush Ranger complied with such requests. It delivered fire into a zone that was inside the minimum safe distance established by any conventional military doctrine for protecting friendly forces from the effects of their own supporting fire. It extracted the patrol. It then expended every remaining round of ammunition carried by the aircraft against the surrounding area before breaking off and heading back to base. And Wiggins and the crew chief were standing on the skids during this entire sequence of events. Not sitting in their seats, as the regulations specified, but standing on the exterior skids of a moving aircraft, their Canvas tethers doing the work that physics and regulations had distributed between them, looking directly straight down at the firefight that was unfolding below their feet. Their machine guns firing into the vegetation while the aircraft banked through its extraction maneuver. That is what the role looked like from the perspective of the man performing it, standing on a skid, looking straight down, firing into whatever was below. The Air Defence Guards of the Royal Australian Air Force, who volunteered to serve as door gunners alongside their primary perimeter security duties, accumulated, across the full period of Australia's military commitment to Vietnam, a military medal, 8 separate mentions in dispatches, and 4 distinguished flying medals. These recognitions were earned in a combat role that they were performing as a secondary assignment layered on top of their designated function. No institutional planning document had designated them as a combat force when they arrived. The war had made that operational determination for them, in the way that the war made most of the determinations that actually mattered, without prior consultation and without subsequent apology. The aggregate mathematics of what this entire operational tempo produced across the full length of the helicopter campaign in Vietnam have never been assembled and presented publicly in a form that makes their combined meaning visible and comprehensible. The individual statistics that appear in various histories and memorials tell partial truths in isolation from each other. Assembled into a single accounting, they reveal something about the nature of this war and this role that the doctrine's architects had reasons not to want confronted directly. Of 7,013 UH-1 Iroquois that served in Vietnam across the length of the American commitment, 3,304 were destroyed before the war ended. 47%, nearly half of every Huey the Army sent to Vietnam never came home from it. Between 1966 and 1971, the years of maximum operational intensity, the Army lost 1 aircraft for every 7.9 sorties flown in support of combat operations. Not 1 per 100 sorties. 1 per 7.9. Any door gunner who flew regularly understood, whether he had expressed it as a formal calculation or simply carried it as a kind of physical awareness in his chest before each mission, that the mathematics of survival in his specific role were running against him, with a consistency that increased with every additional sortie he completed. The human accounting ran alongside and beneath the mechanical one. 2,704 non-pilot crew members, crew chiefs and door gunners combined, were killed across the entire war. 2,165 pilots died alongside them in the same aircraft. Together, those deaths represent approximately 7% of every name that has been carved into the black granite of the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington, from an occupational category that comprised a relatively small fraction of the total American personnel who served in Vietnam. Between 1966 and 1971 specifically, 564 pilots, 1,155 crewmen, and 682 passengers were killed in helicopter accidents alone, before the enemy had contributed a single additional round to the final accounting. This is the point at which the 5-minute legend requires precise and careful examination rather than simple repetition. The figure originated in a Time magazine article from the war years, was amplified and spread through the testimony of veterans who understood intuitively what it was trying to communicate, and became embedded permanently in the cultural record of the conflict, as a description of what the door gunner experienced during the specific seconds of a committed approach to a landing zone under active enemy fire. It captured something that was genuinely and precisely real. During those particular moments, the margin between continued existence and its sudden end was as thin as it becomes in combat. But as a statistical description of tour-length survival probability for men who flew regularly across a full year of service, the number was factually incorrect. Men flew 4 and 5 times a week for 12 months. Most of them came home at the end of their tours. The myth survived and spread because it communicated an emotional truth about the experience that the actual statistical survival rates did not and could not convey. Every man who flew in those doorways lived inside the 5-minute experience. Not for 5 minutes during a single dramatic mission, but across every mission of an entire 12-month tour. The men who reached for that number were not attempting to falsify a statistic. They were attempting to describe a condition of sustained existence under a specific kind of pressure. And they chose a number because a condition of sustained existence under that kind of pressure resists adequate description in any other available form. What the actual figures capture, with a precision that no legend can approach, is the simultaneous reality of the Huey as both the most dangerous posting in the war and the most powerful instrument of survival that the war produced. The same aircraft, the same crews, the same door gunners whose casualties contributed to those lost statistics flew 496,573 medical evacuation missions and extracted over 900,000 patients from battlefields across Vietnam. A wounded American soldier in Vietnam could reasonably expect to reach a surgical facility within 1 hour of sustaining his injury. In the Second World War and in Korea, that transit time between wound and surgical care was measured in days rather than hours. The mortality rate among wounded soldiers in Vietnam fell from 2.5 deaths per 100 wounded in Korea to less than 1 death per 100 wounded in Vietnam. That reduction in the lethality of combat injury, sustained and compounded across the full length of the war, represents hundreds of thousands of individual human lives that continued rather than ended. It was produced, in very substantial part, by men making the decision to fly into what was actively attempting to destroy them because wounded soldiers were waiting. The word used by the medical evacuation crews for their own missions was dust-off, a radio call sign that expanded over time into a culture, a professional commitment, and a specific way of understanding what the role required at its most fundamental level of obligation. Major Charles L. Kelly, the first dust-off commander to be killed in action during the Vietnam War, died on the 1st of July, 1964, while attempting to land his unarmed medical evacuation helicopter under heavy enemy fire to retrieve wounded soldiers who needed to be moved. His final recorded radio transmission before the round that ended the conversation, also ended his life, was 4 words. "When I have your wounded." Not when the fire stops and it is safe to approach. Not when the situation on the ground has been adequately secured. When I have your wounded. Those 4 words became the operational motto of every dust-off crew that followed him, the measure against which each crew evaluated its own willingness to do what the mission required. They answered the fundamental question of what the job demanded before anyone had finished asking it. The man who most completely and durably embodied that tradition, who demonstrated through his personal operational record what the commitment behind those 4 words actually looked like when it was tested under maximum pressure, was a chief warrant officer from Etna, Pennsylvania, who had been formally informed by the United States Air Force that he was simply too old for the war he was applying to participate in. Michael Joseph Novosel had flown B-29 Superfortress heavy bombers during the Second World War. He had been stationed at Tinian Island in the Pacific in 1945, flying combat missions with the 58th Bombardment Wing against targets in Japan. He had been airborne during the Japanese surrender ceremony, commanding a B-29 as part of a 462 aircraft flyover of the proceedings. After the war, he became a commercial airline pilot, accumulating thousands of flight hours and the professional seniority and financial security that come to a man who has already demonstrated whatever needed demonstrating. When Vietnam escalated into a full-scale war, he made the decision that he needed to be part of it. The Air Force informed him that he was too old. He was 41 years of age at the time of the conversation. The flying positions being filled required younger men with longer service horizons ahead of them. And there was no available vacancy for a lieutenant colonel who wanted to return to a combat aircraft. Novosel's specific response to this determination was to surrender his rank of lieutenant colonel entirely, join the Army as a chief warrant officer at the lowest commissioned officer grade available to him, learn to fly helicopters from the beginning as a student pilot, and deploy to Vietnam to fly unarmed medical evacuation missions for wounded soldiers. He gave up his rank. He gave up his seniority. He gave up every professional advantage and every career protection he had spent 20 years building for the singular opportunity to fly an unarmed Huey over an active war zone and carry the wounded away from what was killing them. The Air Force had concluded that the calculation regarding his age did not favor his participation in the war. He had performed the same. He had calculation and arrived at a different answer. During his 2 tours of service in Vietnam, Novosel flew 2,543 missions and extracted 5,589 wounded personnel from battlefields across the country. His aircraft flew with a red cross on the nose, the internationally recognized mark of protected medical status under the Geneva Convention, a protection that the North Vietnamese forces he flew over did not consistently choose to honor. The dust-off Huey he commanded was not a weapons platform of any description. It was a target that had made the organizational decision to keep coming back regardless of what that decision cost on any given day. On the 2nd of October, 1969, in Kien Tuong Province near the Cambodian border, Novosel received notification that a group of South Vietnamese soldiers had been pinned down and were taking casualties from a large North Vietnamese force, unable to move there, wounded without outside assistance that was not reaching them. He flew to their position without gunship escort, without armed cover of any kind from any source. What his aircraft encountered when it arrived was enemy fire concentrated enough and accurate enough that he was unable to reach the casualty positions on his first approach to the area. He circled the engagement and returned for a second attempt. The volume and accuracy of the fire drove him out of the area again before he could complete the extraction. He circled and came back a third time, 6 times over the course of that single mission on that single afternoon. Enemy fire of sufficient intensity forced him to break off his approach and leave the area without completing the extraction he had come to accomplish. 6 times. He brought the aircraft back around and descended again toward the defended position. His crew chief and door gunner maintained their positions in the open doorways throughout all 6 approaches and all 6 forced withdrawals, firing from those positions on an unarmed medical aircraft to provide whatever suppression they could generate to give Novosel sufficient cover to make each successive approach survivable. They are not named in most accounts of this mission. The Medal of Honor citation, following the conventions of such official documents, centers its language and its recognition on the commander of the aircraft. The operational reality is that without 2 men maintaining fire from open doorways on 6 separate passes over a defended and alerted enemy position, there would have been no 15th extraction to record in any citation. Near the conclusion of that mission, Novosel identified a wounded soldier lying in a position close to an enemy bunker. He maneuvered his helicopter backward toward the man, hovering the aircraft in reverse flight, maintaining control of the machine while positioning its open door adjacent to the wounded soldier. As the man was being pulled aboard, the aircraft, enemy automatic weapons opened fire at close range directly into the Huey. Multiple rounds struck the aircraft. A round struck Novosel himself. He lost control of the aircraft momentarily, the machine pitching and the instruments swinging through readings that did not correspond to stable flight. And then he recovered control. He flew the aircraft out of the engagement area with his crew aboard, with the wounded aboard, with 29 men alive who had not been alive to rescue an hour earlier. President Nixon presented Novosel the Medal of Honor on the 15th of June, 1971. At 48 years of age, he became the oldest member of the Army to receive that decoration for actions taken during the Vietnam War. The institution that had formally determined he was too old for the war subsequently awarded him its highest recognition for his service in it. 3 months before his tour was scheduled to conclude, a new pilot submitted his assignment request to the 82nd Medical Detachment. He was Warrant Officer Michael J. Novosel, Jr., who had earned his pilot wings on the 15th of December, 1969, which was 27 years to the exact calendar day that his father had earned his wings a generation earlier. They served in the same unit and flew the same missions. Novosel Sr. gave his son the dollar ride, which was the traditional first orientation flight in country for a new arrival. They flew together in the same medical evacuation unit. And then, before the father's tour of duty was scheduled to end, the son's aircraft was shot down during a mission. Novosel Sr. heard the Mayday transmission from 15 minutes away and flew to respond to it. He extracted his son from the downed aircraft in a flooded rice paddy, brought him aboard the Huey alongside the wounded he was already carrying from a previous extraction, and flew everyone out of the area. He had rescued his own son from a combat crash site in an active war zone using the same aircraft and the same methods he applied to every other mission he flew. The following week, without any prior planning or dramatic arrangement, the situation reversed itself completely. The son's aircraft extracted the father when his helicopter was shot down during a mission. They became the first father and son pilot team in the recorded history of warfare to rescue each other from separate combat crashes during the same deployment to the same theater. There is no medal that exists for that specific act. There should be. The war the door gunners flew on a daily basis was not composed, in its actual majority, of days like the 2nd of October, 1969. The extraordinary existed within and depended upon an architecture of ordinary that the histories and the commemorations consistently and significantly underreport. Because ordinariness does not generate citations for valor and leaves correspondingly lighter traces in the documentary record that historians work from. A typical operational week for a door gunner serving in the Central Highlands of Vietnam involved 4 to 5 missions of varying type and danger level. Some of those missions were combat assault insertions into contested landing zones, where everything a man had learned across months of service would be called upon simultaneously, and the outcome would not be known until it was over. Many others were ammunition resupply runs to fire support bases, personnel transfer flights between installations, reconnaissance insertion missions into areas where nothing of any tactical significance happened, and no rounds were exchanged with anyone. On those quieter days, the door gunner occupied his position, maintained his situational awareness, fired at nothing because there was nothing to fire at, and returned to base with a full ammunition load. He was considered, by the operational standards that governed this particular war, to have had a fortunate day. Before each flight, regardless of its anticipated danger level, the preparatory work began in the darkness before dawn. The crew chief was the only member of the 4-man crew whose specific and personal professional responsibility was the mechanical condition of the aircraft he flew. The door gunner assisted with this responsibility and shared in its consequences. Before first light on mission days, the M60 was stripped to its component parts, cleaned of the carbon and dirt and moisture that accumulated in the conditions of Vietnam, and reassembled by hands that had performed the process enough times to do it reliably without adequate light. Ammunition belts were inspected individual link by individual link for feed strip damage of the type that could cause a stoppage at the exact moment when continuous fire was most critically necessary. Spare barrels were inventoried and positioned for quick access. Mounting hardware was checked for security. None of this routine maintenance attracted historical attention of any kind. It was the invisible and unglamorous foundation upon which every subsequent act of documented courage rested. Between missions, men ate military rations in the shade of their aircraft and made the collective tacit decision not to discuss what had happened on the previous mission or what was likely to happen on the next one. The psychology of repeated extreme experience is not a complicated phenomenon, but it is one that people who have not lived within it consistently misunderstand from the outside. The men who flew 200 missions across a 12-month tour were not fearless individuals who had transcended normal human responses to danger. Fearlessness requires a fundamental ignorance of the danger that exists. And these men understood their danger with a precision that the loss rates and the glowing barrels and the rounds coming through the aluminum floor made impossible to avoid or minimize. What they had developed through accumulated experience was the specific capacity to place that understanding somewhere in their consciousness that allowed continued function, somewhere that permitted them to strap in and descend into the approach and do what the mission required, and then retrieve it intact on the other side. Whether that capacity for managed compartmentalization was sustainable across an entire human lifetime was a question that nobody in possession of institutional authority had been prepared to ask in 1968. What it produced in the long term, in the bodies and nervous systems and interpersonal relationships of the men who had developed it, was damage that the medical establishment of the 1960s and 70s possessed no language adequate to describe and no established protocol to treat. Post-traumatic stress disorder was not formally recognized and incorporated into the official diagnostic system as a legitimate psychiatric condition until 1980, which was 5 full years after the last American combat helicopter crew flew an operational mission in Vietnam. The men who came home from the doorways in 1968 and 1969 returned to a country that had turned against the war they had fought in and needed somewhere accessible to direct the discomfort of its own complicity in that war. Many of those returning veterans became that designated location. They encountered hostility at airports they were passing through. They were called things at the points of entry into the country they had spent a full year in an open doorway defending. Larry Kipp flew more than 2,100 medical evacuation combat missions during his service in Vietnam. He came home through the Seattle airport in 1970. He was called a baby killer by someone waiting in the same terminal. He recounted this incident decades later without any particular bitterness in his voice, which is itself a specific and meaningful form of testimony about the distance a man must travel internally to arrive at that particular degree of equanimity regarding that particular category of experience. John Masaki carried a specific weight that the official record did not acknowledge or address in any form. The runner he had engaged from his gunship during a mission, the individual target that turned out upon investigation to be a non-combatant rather than a combatant. The decision executed in a fraction of a second at altitude in response to a direct order from the command aircraft above him that could not be reversed or recalled once it was made, was not formally debriefed in any meaningful sense, not processed through any institutional mechanism designed to help a young man understand what had happened to him and why. The court-martial threat that arose from the incident materialized for a period and then dissolved without formal resolution. What it left behind was not a legal record. What it left behind was a man who acknowledged, decades later and in carefully chosen words, that his wartime experiences had probably affected some of his interpersonal relationships in ways that he had not fully anticipated. He said it carefully. he said it once. The sound proved to be the most durable and most persistent element of what the war had deposited in the men who flew through it. Not the memories of specific missions with specific outcomes. Not the statistical arithmetic of losses and extractions and survival margins. The acoustic signature of the two-bladed rotor of the UH-1 Iroquois. The Huey produced its immediately recognizable rhythm because each rotor blade passed through the turbulent wake left by the blade that had preceded it, creating a rhythmic double pulse that carried for miles across open terrain and was acoustically distinct from every other aircraft that had ever been manufactured. Phil Marshall had served as a warrant officer with the 237th Medical Detachment, been shot in the arm during a night extraction mission, and spent decades after the war concluding his service working to restore Hueys to airworthy condition and return them to flight. The sound, he said when asked about it, is something you will never forget. It can bring back good memories and bad memories simultaneously. It can be traumatic to hear unexpectedly. Men who had flown in those doorways stopped mid-sentence at air shows decades after their service, when a restored Huey flew the demonstration pattern overhead. They stopped what they were doing in that moment and looked up at the sky, and whatever conversation or activity had been occupying them before the sound arrived was temporarily located somewhere else entirely. For the American ground troops in Vietnam, who had been wounded and lying in the jungle or the rice paddies waiting for extraction, that sound had been the promise of rescue delivered through the air. The rotors announcing from a distance that someone had made the decision to come for them. For the enemy forces on the ground, the same sound had announced the approach of a weapons system that was in the process of locating their position. For the crews who generated the sound from inside the aircraft, it carried both of these meanings simultaneously and permanently, and it continued to carry both of them for the rest of their lives, arriving without warning in ordinary domestic spaces and carrying memories that showed no particular inclination to diminish with the passage of time. The National Vietnam Veterans Longitudinal Study, completed in 2013, found that Vietnam theater veterans still carried 4 times the risk of post-traumatic stress disorder compared to veterans of the same era who had not served in the Vietnam theater. They carried nearly double the risk of major clinical depression. Those veterans who had documented post-traumatic stress disorder in 1987 were found to be nearly twice as likely to have died by the time of the follow-up study, not from violence or accident, but from the cardiovascular and systemic physical consequences of sustained psychological trauma carried without adequate identification or treatment across decades of civilian life. A separate 43-year longitudinal examination of Australian Vietnam veterans found that 47.9% of them had accepted formal claims for a mental health condition connected to their service. Nearly half from a war that Australia officially and formally remembers as having cost 523 Australian lives. What the door gunners constructed during their years of service, the operational knowledge and the institutional procedures assembled mission by mission through experiences that neither the official history books nor the statistical records document with anything approaching adequate completeness, became the conceptual foundation of modern trauma medicine, though the men who built it were not informed of this contribution and were not present when it was formally recognized and incorporated into medical practice. The reduction in combat mortality they produced through their medevac operations did not remain within the boundaries of Vietnam when the war ended. It became the operating logic of military medicine practiced by every nation that studied the Vietnam experience, and subsequently of civilian emergency medicine practiced in hospitals and trauma centers around the world. The principle that the first 60 minutes following a serious traumatic injury represent the most critical window for effective intervention. The concept that physicians and paramedics came to call the golden hour. derived its foundational practical validation from Huey crews, flying wounded soldiers to surgical facilities in time frames that had simply never been achievable in any previous conflict in human history. Every hospital helicopter flying today, every trauma center calculating transport times, every emergency medical protocol that prioritizes speed of intervention carries that inheritance forward. Almost none of the people who benefit from it know where it came from or who paid the price of establishing it. The airmobile doctrine that Vietnam produced was publicly discredited by the strategic outcome of the war when it ended. The institution that had constructed that doctrine needed to believe that the doctrine's fundamental premises had not been the source of the problem. And so the doctrine was set aside officially and not discussed in polite institutional company for a period of years. Then, with the quiet efficiency of organizations that have learned something valuable at great cost and prefer not to acknowledge the source of the lesson, it was rebuilt piece by piece into every significant American military operation that followed. The helicopter assault operations of Grenada in 1983, of Panama in 1989, of the Persian Gulf in 1991, the sustained air assault operations of Iraq and Afghanistan across the following 2 decades, all descended in their essential operational logic from frameworks that were first conceived, first tested under fire, and first proven both effective and enormously costly in the rice paddies and highland jungles and rubber plantations of South Vietnam. The men who paid the price of that original testing were rarely present when the institutional debt was acknowledged. In many cases, they were not acknowledged at all. In April of 2023, Fort Rucker, Alabama, the installation that had served as the home of Army aviation for generations, the place where every helicopter pilot in the American Army learned to fly and where door gunners were processed and briefed before deployment, was formally renamed by the United States Army. The new name given to the installation was Fort Novosel. Not the name of a general officer, not the name of a Secretary of Defense or a senior policy architect or a president who had authorized the war, the name of a chief warrant officer who had surrendered his lieutenant colonel's rank for the privilege of flying unarmed medical evacuation missions into defended positions, who had been formally told by the Air Force that he was too old for the war, and who had gone back to a defended position 6 times after enemy fire had driven him out of it because the wounded soldiers who needed him were still there each time he returned. The name on the gate of that installation is, in its quiet and understated way, an official acknowledgement of what the position of door gunner and the men who occupied it had always actually been worth to the country that sent them there. On the 26th of September, 2024, President Biden signed the dust-off crews of the Vietnam War Congressional Gold Medal Act into law. The Congressional Gold Medal is the highest civilian honor that the United States Congress possesses the authority to bestow. The act formally recognized the pilots, crew chiefs, medics, and door gunners who flew those 500,000 medical evacuation missions and carried hundreds of thousands of wounded soldiers away from what was killing them. The ceremony of recognition came 51 years after the last American combat helicopter crew flew an operational mission in Vietnam. General Patrick Brady, who had himself flown 3 separate aircraft in a single day through dense fog and sustained enemy fire to evacuate 51 wounded soldiers and had received the Medal of Honor for that day's work, stood at the ceremony and offered what may be the plainest and most accurate description of what the job had required across all the years it was performed. Occasionally, he said, you will hear of first responders running into danger. The dust-off crews did it over and over again, over and over again. That is the sentence that official recognition required 51 years to say publicly. The men who heard it spoken at that ceremony were in their 70s and 80s. Some of them had already buried the friends and crew members who should by rights have been standing in the same room. Some had spent decades of sustained and difficult personal work, making their way back toward something that resembled the peace they had left when they first shipped out. Some had never fully completed that journey and knew by that point in their lives that they probably would not. All of them had flown the missions that needed flying, occupied the doorways that needed occupying, held the machine guns that needed holding, and returned or did not return. And the ones who returned had carried what they witnessed and what they did, and what those years of missions had permanently done to their nervous systems for half a century before their country formally registered that it had been watching what they were doing the entire time. The popular legend says that the door gunner on a Vietnam-era Huey had a life expectancy of 5 minutes in combat. That number was wrong as a statistical description of survival rates across a tour of duty. But every man who flew in those doorways inhabited the 5-minute experience, not for 5 minutes during one exceptional mission, but across 365 days of service, and across every one of the 200 approaches to landing zones where an enemy who had studied the geometry of the situation was already in position and already waiting. Each time, the canvas tether held the man in the doorway. Each time, the barrel fired until it reached its physical limits. Each time, the man came back to base or he did not. And the ones who came back strapped in again the following morning and flew the same missions again. They were not fearless men. Fearlessness requires a fundamental ignorance of the danger that exists in a given situation. And these men possessed no such ignorance. They had absorbed the loss rates and the destruction statistics with their eyes open. They had changed barrels that were glowing red in their hands. They had heard the Mayday transmissions of crews that did not complete their returns, and had suited up and flown the next morning's missions regardless. They were afraid in those doorways in the specific and accurate way that men who understand their situation precisely are afraid. And they went anyway, every mission, for a full year, in spite of everything the mathematics told them, and in spite of everything the accumulated experience of their service had shown them about what the doorway would eventually demand. That is not 5 minutes of courage performed once for the historical record. That is what courage actually looks like when it is required not on a single exceptional occasion, but every day, accumulated mission by mission across a full year of service, in the open door of a machine that the enemy was continuously and professionally attempting to bring down. Now you know what that cost. And now, knowing it accurately and completely for the first time, you cannot unknow it. If this story belongs to the men who lived it, and it does belong to them entirely, then the least that remains available to the rest of us is to remember it with the precision and the honesty it has always deserved. Share this with someone who needs to hear it told properly. And tell me in the comments which of these men's stories stayed with you after everything else faded.